And welcome back to the second hour of our program. If you want to see some pretty amazing stuff, I mean, some just genuinely amazing stuff, go over to documented.net. Talk about documenting the corruption of American politics. It's absolutely breathtaking. On the line with us is the Deputy Executive Director of documented.net, Brendan Fischer. Brenda's Twitter handle is Brendan_Fischer or at documented, ITS documented. And as I mentioned, documented.net is the website worth checking out. Brendan, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we've talked. I'm so glad you could come back with us. You've got a new piece about how a major right-wing group pours dark money into U.S. voter suppression. Tell us about this.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me back, Tom. So we reported with The Guardian about how the advocacy arm of the Heritage Foundation spent well over $5 million on outside lobbying in 2021 as it worked to block voting rights at the federal level and to advance strict voting rights legislation at the state level. And this is a substantial jump from Heritage Action's activities, outside lobbying activities in the prior year. And it coincides with a substantial jump in the voter suppression laws passed in 2021. More voter suppression laws were passed in 2021 than in the prior decade.
So what is I think most people recognize the name Heritage Foundation, but what is their proclaimed purpose, and how does that purpose, how is that advanced or fulfilled by trying to suppress the vote?
Well, it's a great question. Well, Heritage Action says that it's working to advance conservative principles, conservative free market principles. And what does making it harder to vote have to do with advancing free market and conservative principles? That's a good question. But ultimately, powerful dark money interests like Heritage Action, Heritage Foundation, and their donors benefit when fewer people vote. Wealthy special interests have more power when voters are not engaged and voters are unable to have their voices heard at the ballot box.
So Heritage Action then is functionally the voice of the morbidly rich?
That's one way of putting it. Heritage Action does raise a lot of money from very wealthy donors. Rebecca Mercer, for example, is on the Heritage Action board. And the way that Heritage Action has worked in recent years, the role that it played in blocking pro-democracy legislation at the federal level and advancing anti-democracy legislation at the state level is an indication of how powerful dark money interests have poured massive resources into protecting a broken political system and undermining our freedom to vote.
Yeah, if memory serves me correctly, Rebecca Mercer made her money the old-fashioned way. She inherited it. What's the relationship between Heritage and ALEC? Because, usually when you think of trying to, in this case, passing voter suppression laws on a state-by-state basis, these are not federal laws, that many of your more, shall we say, right-wing or conservative or whatever you want to call this these days, pieces of legislation that keep popping up in state after state, whether it was Stand Your Ground back in the day or, stuff that helps the tobacco industry or stuff that helps the gun industry or stuff that helps the fossil fuel industry or stuff that helps the banking industry. An awful lot of that comes out of ALEC. How did Heritage get into this scam or this business? And what's the relationship between the two and other groups?
Yeah, well, ALEC really operates as a clearinghouse to advance conservative policy on the state level. And Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action have worked hand in hand with ALEC on policies like voting and others. And we at Documented actually obtained a private plan that Heritage Action developed last year. And they set out this 2-year, $24 million strategy to work with ALEC to advance restrictive voting bills in 8 battleground states. So Heritage Action and ALEC have worked together and have described how they've worked together. But Heritage Action, in some ways, is supplanting a role that traditionally would have been played by ALEC. Heritage Action has talked about how they've developed model legislation or the principles that have been incorporated into legislation. And then what they've done that ALEC has not done is actually activate activists at the state level. It's what Heritage calls their sentinels. So Heritage and their lawyers and their lobbyists will help state legislators in states like Georgia to actually draft legislation, and then their network of activists will then advocate for those bills in the states. And Heritage Action then even goes beyond that. In addition to having formal lobbying and grassroots lobbying to push this legislation, they'll then run TV ads, in some cases millions of dollars in TV ads, helping to make the case for these bills. That was the case in Georgia, for example. Heritage Action boasted about spending over $1 million in ads supporting the restrictive Georgia bill that was enacted in 2021. And after that bill sparked controversy, and you saw business leaders across the country speaking out against it, Heritage Action actually spent over $1 million on TV ads defending the law. And they were targeted, those ads were targeted at business leaders. The ads were run on CNBC, for example. And those ads were targeted at what Heritage Action's executive director said were woke CEOs who didn't read the bill. So Heritage Action is raising a ton of money and spending a ton of money to advance this, to not only advance restrictive voting legislation, but also to build the case for it in the public and among influencers.
So the eight states where this two-year strategy is being played out by Heritage Action, according to your article, I'm looking over here at on The Guardian, the Heritage Founder Voter Suppression Lobby and Election Plan, are Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Michigan, Nevada, Texas, and Wisconsin. By coincidence, these are all battleground states. I'm assuming it's just a purely a coincidence. What possible rationalization? I mean, I asked you, why are these guys doing it? And your answer was pretty straightforward, but how do they rationalize it themselves? How do these folks sleep at night? Do they not believe in democracy? Is there a widespread belief among American plutocrats, which, by the way, would not be ahistoric? I mean, the history is filled with people, who have argued this position all the way back to Socrates, that plutocracy or oligarchy is really a more stable form of government than democracy. And democracy was a nice, quaint experiment, but it's kind of served its purpose. And now it's time for those truly successful people, proving their success by the fact that they're insanely rich, to take over. I mean, is that what's going on? What is their internal rationale? What story do they tell to themselves?
Yeah, well, the story they tell to themselves might be different than the story they tell to the public. The story they tell to the public is that election fraud is rampant, or at least the risks of election fraud is rampant.
Now, we know that's a lie, right?
Right. But Heritage Foundation and its advocacy arm, Heritage Action, have played a key role in advancing that lie. And they've worked really hard to try and come up with evidence to support it. But they've largely been unsuccessful. You may be familiar with Hans von Spakovsky. He's one of the top election fraudsters, and he's been pushing the lie of election fraud for decades now. He's a senior fellow with the Heritage Foundation and maintains an election fraud database that claims to identify all of the potential evidence of fraud over recent decades. But really, it shows just how rare fraud is in the U.S. system. Its records date back 40 years, but even during this period where billions of votes have been cast, Heritage Foundation can only find just over 1,000 potential instances of voter fraud, which is just a molecular fraction of votes cast nationwide. So the cure that Heritage and its partners are advocating, more restrictive voting laws, hardly correlates with the problem, even as they've identified it.
Yeah, in fact, I've debated Hans on this program. or Hans Van Spaskowski. So what do we do? We're speaking with Brandon Fischer, I lost my page with your title here, the Deputy Executive Director of Documented.net. And also, if you want to read a quick piece on this, obviously go to documented.net, but over at The Guardian, it's titled, Right-Wing Group Pours Millions in Dark Money into U.S. Voter Suppression Bid. What can or should we do about this, Brendan?
Well, one thing we could do is remain engaged. Part of what Heritage Action and Heritage Foundation try to do is muddy the waters around what the problems are and what the solutions are to those problems. I think we need to stay engaged and stay focused on the importance of protecting our freedom to vote, and then also we need to vote. We need to make sure that our voices are heard in the elections, and to organize and advocate to overcome the barriers that Heritage Action and their partners are trying to set up.
Yeah. And inform everybody you know. It's documented.net is the website. You really need to check this out. Brendan Fischer, our old buddy, he's now the Deputy Executive Director of Documented and an attorney as well. Brendan, thanks so much for dropping by. Great seeing you again. Happy New Year.
Thanks for having me.